Hello everybody, welcome back. We are still in our video series on supply and demand. In the last video, we brought supply and demand together and talked about equilibrium. And now we're going to use the principles we've learned and the mechanics that we've learned to actually start talking about how we can use supply and demand to discuss policy. So let's dive in. We're going to be looking at surpluses and shortages, as well as price ceilings and price floors, and then apply these to the labor market as well as immigration. We're going to start with surpluses. In a surplus, we have excess supply. So the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And we'll look at this through this example with jerseys. And so let's suppose that the price in the market at the moment is $50. At that price, we come over, and there's our quantity demanded at about 10. Quantity demanded. At that price, we also have our quantity supplied over here at the supply curve. And our quantity supplied is 25. So quantity demanded of 10, quantity supplied of 25, leading to a surplus of everything here in between. That's our surplus, and that's 15 jerseys, right? We just get that through subtraction. So it's as if at a high price, it also makes sense. At a higher price, sellers are going to be more willing to sell. At a higher price, buyers are going to be less likely to buy. And so you're going to have this surplus, or you can kind of think of it as extra inventory. And what are sellers going to do as a result if they've got all these built up goods not getting off the shelves, which you actually see this in grocery stores, things like produce and some fresh salsas, hummus, things like this. If it's sitting there and people aren't buying it, what starts to happen? They cut the price. So if we were up here at the initial price of 50, and here was the initial surplus 0, the sellers, they start to cut the price. So let's do that. We cut the price. Let's bring it down to, let's bring it down to 40. All right. So at 40, here's our quantity demanded. Here's our quantity supplied. And we still have excess supply. Quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded. We still have a surplus. So they cut the price even more. So that was P1. And let's cut it just all the way down to the equilibrium now. P star, somewhere around 32 bucks or so. And at that price, here we have quantity demanded at that price. We have quantity supplied. They're now equal to each other, and we're back in equilibrium. Okay, so when sellers face a surplus, they cut the price until we reach at a point back to equilibrium. We do something similar on the shortage side. So excess demand, where quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. We use an example of headphones and suppose that the current price is $20. So at $20, we come over here. There's our quantity supplied of 15. At a lower price, the quantity demanded is going to be higher. QD, so we have excess demand, and this area in here is the shortage. Okay, quantity demanded 25. Quantity supplied is 15. Subtract to get a shortage of 10 headphones. And just in the same way, if there's a shortage of things, the sellers can't keep them on the shelves. They're flying off the rack. Sellers are going to take those and start to increase the price. Okay, so we have the initial shortage here. They increase the price a bit. And if they increase it to say 25, there's still going to be a shortage. of this area in between here. And if there's still a shortage, they still increase the price up to the equilibrium where quantity demanded is equal again to quantity supplied. Okay, so shortages, sellers increase the prices, surpluses, sellers decrease the prices until we get to the equilibrium. Okay, let's look at some examples of this. First is a price ceiling. So a legal maximum on a price of a good or service. The example we'll talk about here are rent ceilings. Rent ceilings. And so this is if some mayor or a governor, probably more likely a mayor in a city, will place a legal maximum on rent to try it with the intention in mind to keep apartments affordable. We're going to look at two cases here. The first is this idea of a non-binding price ceiling or rent ceiling. So our equilibrium price in the market is $600. If there's a rent ceiling put in place above the equilibrium price, so let's say at $1,000, the mayor says the price of the ceiling is $1,000, and that means anything above $1,000 is illegal. Well, here, the market reaches a point where the equilibrium price is below the legal limit, so it's actually no problem. If the price ceiling is above the equilibrium price, we call it non-binding, and there's no effect. So the market still ends up right where it would have otherwise at P star and Q star. Okay, which is both the quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Non-binding case, not so interesting. But if we have a binding price ceiling, an equilibrium price that is, this should say, this should say below. So an equilibrium price below the price ceiling. No, that's right. An equilibrium price above the price ceiling. If it said a price ceiling below the equilibrium, those are equivalent to each other. Okay, so here again, we take our same market equilibrium price of $600 for an apartment, and we put in a price ceiling of, say, $300. So anything above $300 is deemed illegal in the effort to make housing more affordable, the price of the ceiling. But that now makes this price equilibrium price of $600 illegal. So landlords are going to have to drop the prices of their apartments down to, we're going to call this $300. So at that price, we come over to the supply curve. At lower prices, there's less willingness and ability to supply, in this case, the housing. But also at lower prices, more people want housing, so the quantity demanded increases. And what do we have here? Quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied. That's excess demand for a shortage. Okay, so in here we have our shortage. Causes a shortage. So for the people who still have the housing, which ultimately it's the quantity supplied, that's how much housing is available. For the people who still have housing, it's great. It works out. They're paying, in this case, half rent. But this price ceiling put into place causes now a shortage, so that there's less housing available. The quantity supplied of housing decreases from the equilibrium. And then the other general thing that happens is that the quality of housing tends to decrease as well. Because if now you can only charge $300 for rent instead of $600, you might not put in those stainless steel appliances. You might use cheaper materials when you're doing repairs. And so price ceilings, although intended to help, have some adverse consequences, unintended consequences inside these housing markets. Okay, so binding price, binding constraint, binding price ceiling causes shortages. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about some applications of price floors and surpluses. But to do that, I want to introduce the labor market, which is slightly different than the markets we've been talking about. So in the market for, say, computers, we as individuals demand computers and companies supply computers to us. This is the opposite in a labor market. As individuals, we supply our labor as workers. So the workers, the individuals, make up the supply, and it's the firms that make up the demand. Firms demand labor, workers supply labor. And the price in the labor market is just the wage, and the quantity in the labor market is the jobs. And I'll say one extra thing in particular: the quantity demanded coming from the firms is the actual number of jobs that are being offered. Even if the quantity supplied is high, a lot of people want to work. Ultimately, the number of jobs, the employment, comes down to the quantity demanded. Okay, so here's our labor market. This is what it looks like generally, and we're going to use this to talk about price floors and in particular minimum wages. Okay, another example of a price floor that we won't talk about here, but you'll also sometimes find minimums on alcohol and tobacco as well, as another example. Okay, but here we're talking about the labor market. We're again going to look at the two cases, a non-binding and a binding price floor. Here, equilibrium price is $6. We can call this $6 an hour, say. And then we put in a minimum wage of, call it $3. So the price for the minimum wage is equal to 3. That means anything below $3 is illegal. It's illegal to pay less than $3 an hour. But the equilibrium wage in this case is above the price floor. It's above 3. So again, it's what we consider non-binding and no effect on the market outcome. The more interesting case is a binding price floor where we have our equilibrium wage of $6 and we put in a higher minimum wage. So let's call it $10. So now anything below $10 is illegal, the price for the minimum wage. And so now our $6 equilibrium is illegal. Firms have to start paying their workers $10. So we take our $10 over to the demand curve. There's our quantity demanded. And we take it over to the supply curve. There's our quantity supplied. Okay, and now what do we have? Quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded. This is excess supply, which in the labor market, if you have excess supply, more people who want to work, who are willing and able to work, than firms are willing and able to hire, we call this unemployment. So the idea here is that you increase the minimum wage, and that could result in higher unemployment. And that's this difference right here. Unemployment. Our labor excess supply means we also have what would be called the labor surplus. Okay, so we're going to take this and now start to do some more market dynamics with it. But first, I want to show you one thing, particularly with labor markets, which we're going to see here with unemployment and also with things like high-skilled immigration. The supply and demand framework is somewhat useful, but in a very complex market like the labor market, there's really a lot more to it than just supply and demand. So I'm going to show you real quick what some of the nation's leading economists think about minimum wages. Okay, so we're back. This is what's called the IGM Economic Experts Panel, and it's composed of about approximately 50 of the nation's, well, and the world's really, greatest economists. And what happens is they are given these propositions and they have to decide based on their knowledge and evidence and research whether they agree or disagree with any given proposition. So this one, coming back down from 2015, it says if the federal minimum wage is raised gradually to $15 an hour, the employment rate for low-wage workers will be substantially lower than it would under the status quo. So essentially, taking what we were looking at here and seeing if we put in a minimum wage, it's going to increase unemployment, and it's going to basically decrease the quantity demanded, because we started here at our initial equilibrium point, which was our initial quantity demanded, and so the number of jobs. And so we put in a minimum wage, and it decreases employment. And so that's what's happening here. It's just asking these economists, do you agree with that analysis? And so here are their responses. It's primarily uncertainty with pretty equal levels of agreement and disagreement on both sides. So like I was saying, labor markets are very complex, and kind of there's more analysis to it than just a very basic supply and demand framework. And so yeah, this site is great. If you scroll down, you see more things, and you can see who the economists are who voted, how they voted, and some of them put comments. Not all of them, but some of them do. Okay, so great website. I'm going to come back here in a few minutes to show you their thoughts on immigration. Okay, so back to the notes. We looked at unemployment, and now what I want to do is keep unemployment, but now start to do some market dynamics, and in this case, we're going to increase the demand for labor. So we start with this level of unemployment here. I'll just put UN for unemployment, 0. And what we want to do is increase the demand for labor. This could come from a number of purposes, but just think back to those demand curve shifters from a few videos ago. Any increase in the number of buyers increases demand. So buyers in this case are the firms. So an increase in firms will increase the demand for labor. One of our demand curve shifters was income. And in this case, we're talking about firm income. So if profits are increasing, if the economy is doing great, it can increase the demand for labor. Okay, so we look at this initial unemployment, and we increase the demand. So shift to the right, D1. And what does that do? We're still stuck at our minimum wage price. But we take that price over to the demand curve, and it's here. Let's call that 1,300. And the quantity supplied is still the same at 1,500. And so what happens to the number of unemployed workers? Before, we started over here at 500. So we had 1,500 minus 500 for a total of 1,000 unemployed workers. Now our new quantity demanded is 1,500 minus 1,300 for a total of 200 unemployed. An increase in the demand for labor, things are doing well, economy is doing well, that's going to cause unemployment to decrease. So unemployment decreases. Okay, so that's this analysis with minimum wage, but still doing some market dynamics, changing supply and demand. Okay, an increase in the supply of labor. Again, a little different. We start with this initial unemployment 0. We increase the supply S1, and we have a new, much larger unemployment rate, unemployment 1. And so before, I'm not going to use exact numbers here, but before and after, we can clearly see that if we're starting here, unemployment increases by quite a bit in the end. So unemployment increases. Okay, if you want, you can grab the numbers, but it's all kind of approximate. So anyway, just labor, supply and demand dynamics applied to the labor market, just as any market. Okay, and then finally, to round out the video and the whole series on supply and demand, we're going to end about talking about immigration. So immigration in the labor market, the primary effect of incoming immigration is going to be an increase in supply, right? You have more people, the supply is made up of the workers, so we have an increase in the number of workers. So just as on the last page, what happens, whether we're talking about whether there's a minimum wage in place or not, if we look at this equilibrium wage to begin, P star 0, immigration comes along, and one of the big questions is, okay, if there's immigration, what happens to domestic wages? And so again, the basic supply and demand analysis says that the equilibrium wage is going to go down, and unemployment, which started here, is going to increase. So wages go down, and unemployment increases. So again, it doesn't look so great for immigration, but because we're dealing with labor markets, which are a little bit more complex, ultimately there's more going on than just that initial effect. So we do have that primary effect of the supply increasing, but because we're talking about people and not products, if the supply of a product increases, then we're done. But if people come into the country, they're also buying things. So the places from which they're buying need to increase production. To increase production, they need to hire more workers. That's going to increase demand. Immigrants also are highly entrepreneurial and in fact have higher rates of self-employment and entrepreneurship than Americans themselves. So that also is going to increase the demand for labor as they start companies. So immigrants come into the country, yes, the supply increases, so we can draw that. But also the demand increases, the demand for labor. And so where we would have had this decrease in the price down to P1, let me throw our initial equilibrium in there as well, P star 0, it's quite possible that this increase in immigration, which also increases demand, some of that price decrease will be offset. So here's one example where the price, let's say P star 2, doesn't go all the way down, but it's partially offset by this increase in demand. But we can have another case where, depending on how big that increase in demand is, okay, P star 0, we throw in the immigration, supply increases, demand increases as well, and we could end up in a place like this, where we have P star 1, and the price, the domestic wages actually increase, and similar offsetting effects on unemployment as well. So because there are two things happening at once with immigration, and it's a much more complicated process than a simple increase in the supply curve, the end result is quite ambiguous, and the debate on immigration still exists. Now, if we're talking about high-skilled immigration in particular, then we have even more things going on in the background behind, besides the labor market and other effects as well. So I want to finish off the video by going back to that IGM Economics Experts panel to show you what they think about high-skilled immigration in particular. So let's go over there. Okay, and so back on the IGM Economic Experts panel, looking at high-skilled immigrants, and the proposition is that the U.S. citizen would be better off if a larger number of highly educated foreign workers were legally allowed to immigrate to the U.S. each year. So again, these 50 economists, some of the brightest in the country at the best universities, they agree or disagree with this. It's not necessarily the labor market. They're talking more generally about just being better off. But let's see what they say. It's significant agreement with just a very small fraction of uncertainty, 5% uncertainty, 6% if you weight it by confidence. But a lot of strong agreement and agreement that the average citizen would be better off if we allow a larger number of highly educated foreign workers to immigrate to the U.S. each year. So again, it's much more complicated than just increasing the supply curve. There are significant benefits from having an increased labor force, in particular high-skilled labor force coming into the country. So the supply and demand curves, they can help to think about some of these questions, but always be questioning and kind of thinking about what more is there to the story, because it is a model. Models are simplified, and so as you use the model to create some baseline analysis, always continue to think forward and question and be curious about what more is going on under the hood. Okay, so yeah, there in the end we said, okay, what happens to equilibrium wage? Basically, it's ambiguous. It depends on how much the demand curve shifts. Same thing for the unemployment rate. And that gets us to our conclusion for this chapter and for this section on supply and demand. So we see these price controls, price floors, price ceilings. They're often meant to help people in different situations. A price ceiling put in place to keep rents under control. They'll help the people who still have housing, but it creates shortages in housing. You put minimum wages in place, and there's some offsetting effects on a potential reduction in employment. So these policies, always important to consider, not just what's happening, who it's trying to help, but what are potentially some unintended and potentially negative consequences from the policies as well. So that's going to do it for this video and for this section. And the next one, we're going to start talking about some of the big three macroeconomic measurements, which are GDP, unemployment, and inflation. So we'll be coming back to the labor market once we're talking about employment again, but we're going to pick it up next time with GDP, gross domestic product. I'll see you there. Thanks.